way, I can get the modern history basically from the fall of the Second Temple in 70 AD through today in 45 minutes. So if he allows me, we'll discuss it after church. I think we're going to have to carry this into a fourth week, and I'll kind of tell you my thoughts for next week. Some of the stuff that we're not going to get to this week. The Camp David Accords with President Carter were very important. The Oslo Accords. There's a first and a second intifada that's very interesting that happened in the Middle East. There's the Abrahamic Accords. There's the Israel disengagement, where graves were dug up out of the ground. That's very interesting. There's a full discussion I have in my notes on Hezbollah and Hamas. I'd like to do a full review. I think would be helpful. I waited on the handout. I think we probably need to have the full timeline, and probably need to spend a 15-minute with a handout where we kind of are engaging each other and seeing how much we retain, and that way we've got it. Another part that I didn't have in, but the more I got to reading about it, the importance of the Holocaust. So I think I'm going to back up and spend a little bit of time on the Holocaust next week. And then me and Brother Freddie and Zach and my brother-in-law is Angelia's brother. We work together, and we were talking about the issue of the 430 years, or is it 400 years, that Israel was enslaved. We'll touch on that next week in the review if I end up teaching a fourth week. So we'll touch on it then. So we'll just get as far as we can get today. I'll try to build next week's lesson so we have all of that kind of, if I have to trim it down, we'll deal with it. We'll see how today goes. Okay, my picture is, I know, not very accurate. I know people don't carry briefcases to church, but other than that. Don't ruin my punchline. All right. Quick review for those of us who skipped last week, and we'll very quickly. We'll have this next week, but 1916, Joseph sold into slavery. And then, of course, Brother Freddie will touch on this next week about the Israelites being enslaved in Egypt. Israel's population grows. And then in 1406, Joshua and the people conquer Canaan and basically take over the land again. For about a 350-year period, we have Israel ruled by judges and then by kings. And then the first temple is built by Solomon in approximately 966. His reign starts in 970. We covered those dates, and we'll cover this in a little more in depth next week. Assyria conquers the northern kingdom in 722. Babylon then conquers the southern kingdom in 586, and the second temple is destroyed. So by 586 BC, basically, Israel is, for all intents and purposes, wiped out. In 539 BC, King Cyrus of Persia allows the people to go back and begin construction of the new temple. And then in 331, the Greeks defeated the Persians to become the world power. And then eventually, the Roman Empire swallows up the Greek Empire. And that's where we finished last week, with the second temple being destroyed and basically the Jews being scattered out. Okay, so I've tried to break these things up into, maybe it just helps my mind. I told Brother Freddie this is like preparing for a big trial, this thing, every week. But that's the way I break up my trial notes. I have my witnesses, and then I have my cross-examination and my legal argument. So that's just kind of helps me to break these things into pieces by just doing it by parts. So let's talk about the time period from the destruction of the temple to the 1800s. All right, first up. So 70 AD is Jerusalem's conquered, the second temple's destroyed, and there are still some Jews in the land that we know as Israel. And then in 132 AD, a Jewish military leader by the name of Bar Kokhba rises to power for the Israelites, and he initiates a revolt against the Roman Empire, and it's known as the Bar Kokhba Revolt. names. These articles say he basically named everything after himself that this guy did. But he basically, for this 3-year period, a Jewish state is formed again from about 132 AD to 135. So Bar Kokhba appoints himself what they call the Nasi, the Nasi. That was the prince or kind of the ruler of the area. And then a lot of the commentaries I read, interestingly, said that the Jews in the area believed that this was the long-expected Messiah. So they were treating him as if he was the return that had been prophesied about. Well, in 135, the Romans come in and kill him. So his reign was very short-lived, about a 3-year reign. Within a year, there's a very harsh crackdown. And then a Roman historian writes that 580,000 Jews were killed in 135 during this rebellion. It says the Romans, quote, are believed to have run a plow over all or part of the city. The surviving Jews were expelled and were banned from returning to Jerusalem. So you had this short 3-year window here after the destruction of the Second Temple where the Jews kind of form a nation again, but it's short-lived. Can anybody see their Bible to read Deuteronomy 28:64? This is the only verse I'll have y'all read. I got everything else on the screen, but I actually added this morning. I thought this was a good verse to read here. You want to read it? Read it. 28:64. Deuteronomy 28:64. I'll give her. Hold on a second. I'm gonna give her the mic so she can read it because last week's video you couldn't hear it. That's what I was reading. Yeah.
And the Lord shall scatter thee among the people from one end of the earth even unto the other, and there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone.
So Deuteronomy tells about this scattering, and we're going to get into some other prophetical verses today. So here, as of 135 AD, we have almost a complete scattering of the Jews. I put that up there. This guy was celebrated in 1961. Israel released a national stamp to honor him. That's the Bar Kokhba stamp that you see up on the top right. I thought that was kind of interesting that all those years later, they honor what this guy did. All right, so now we're going to jump ahead. Obviously, I'm skipping 450 years, but in the 600 ADs is the rise of the Islamic religion and the Muslims. So in the year 610 AD, a man by the name of Muhammad begins receiving these divine revelations. And he starts telling everybody over here in the Middle East to basically, look, you're going to have to submit to this one God. And in pretty short order, it's not a religious movement. It becomes kind of a military and political movement. By 630, 20 years later, he gathers a large following and they conquer a city there in Saudi Arabia. I've got an arrow at it called Mecca, and we've all heard of Mecca. Before I looked this up on the map this week, I didn't really know where Mecca was at in relation to Israel. But there it is. It's south, right there on the Red Sea. So his followers wind up in this city of Mecca. They conquer it militarily. By 632, it says almost all the tribes of the Arabian Peninsula had converted to his newfound religion, which he called Islam. So 6 years later, in 638, the Islamic Caliphate, I don't know if I've ever heard that word, but it's the Caliphate. They said it's a political religious successor to Muhammad. So it's a specific word that's used for basically Muslim leaders. But the Islamic Caliphate conquers the city of Jerusalem. Any idea how far it is from Mecca to Jerusalem? Just to give us an idea, it's 770 miles. So they're not real far apart. During this period, it says the Jews that had kind of returned to the area were allowed to be there, but the Islamic religion and traditions takes over the region very strongly here in the late 600 ADs. In 685 AD, an Islamic leader named Abd al-Malik comes into power. Never heard of this guy until I started reading about it. And then in 690, any idea what he built? Yeah, he builds the Dome of the Rock, and that's what's pictured there in the bottom right. Now, the Dome of the Rock, and we'll discuss this in just a second, is built directly on top of the temple, Solomon's temple and the second temple as well. So by 690, this has basically become an Islamic-controlled area. Okay, so here's a sidebar, and I know I'm stepping on Clint's area that I think he's going to teach on, but Clint's got size on me, but I'm still pretty quick, so I figure I can. What's the future of the Dome of the Rock? In Amos 9, it says, I will sift the house of Israel among all nations. And in 11, it says, in that day will I raise up the tabernacle of David that is fallen. It says, I will build it as in the days of old. Verse 15, so could they be talking about the second temple in Amos? Well, if you read verse 15, it says, they shall no more be pulled up out of their land which I have given them. Brother Frederick, is it fair to say that Amos is talking about that something's going to be rebuilt there?
That's future.
Okay. And that's the way I read that, because the temple was rebuilt at the time of Amos, but we know it was destroyed. So this has to be a future event. So what's the future of the Dome of the Rock? Apparently, it's going to have to get destroyed at some point to allow the building of the temple. All right. So before we kind of get to the modern stuff, a couple more things I want to touch on. There were a couple crusades. A lady in my office gave me about 3 books. I don't know if y'all saw those this week, Zach, but she said, I love the Crusades. So she gave me these 500-page books. I said, I'm not reading 500 pages on the First Crusade. I got some Wikipedia articles and some other articles I read. So the First Crusade, the objective of this crusade was basically by the late 1000s, in the 1090s or so, there's this Seljuk, S-E-L-J-U-K, Seljuk Empire that is taking over the entire region, which includes Israel, and they're completely threatening to wipe out the Christian race or the Christian population in the area. So a call goes out in this time, and there's a call for faithful Christians that says to undertake an armed pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So this group of people come together, and their goal is to come in and basically restore what they believe is theirs. So before I get to kind of the 2 of the main guys in the First Crusade, I thought this is a really a sidebar. These guys have a couple interesting nicknames that you're about to hear about that kind of lead the First Crusade. And once you hear the names, you'll understand it. So I got to thinking about, I played baseball in high school, and we played at McEachern High School in Powder Springs. And McEachern, I played center field, and McEachern was the only park that we played that the bleachers were directly behind center field. So what does that mean for the center fielder when you go to them to play? You get heckled. I didn't dare for 6 innings. So anyway, they called me Webster. I know it, the little short guy. So they yelled Webster at me for 6 innings, and I was like, man, that's pretty funny, but I didn't turn around. We played 6, 7 innings. I'm not turning around and giving these guys the time of day, but I thought that was a pretty funny nickname. So I got to looking up other unfortunate nicknames, and I just was looking it up when I was working on the lesson. One guy said that he had on his work crew, they called a guy Blisters because he always showed up when the work was done. A guy said he had a friend in high school. He was a 5'2" Mexican guy, and he said him and his buddies called him Paragraph because he was too short to be an essay. Anyway, it has nothing to do with the lesson. But I when I got to reading these nicknames, I said, man, these guys got stuck with some nicknames. But anyway, so back to the Crusades. So a group of predominantly poor Christians are the ones that kind of put a lot of this together. And 2 of the men that headed up the crusade that ended up heading to this area, one guy was named Peter the Hermit. Peter the Hermit was a French preacher that had previously been captured by the Muslims and tortured. He escaped, so now he had a chance for his revenge to go back and try to take on the Muslims in what should be a Christian or Jewish area. There was another knight that they called Walter the Penniless. So anyway, there was some characters that I read about, and but anyway, so that was interesting. But basically, a bunch of poor Christians came together and said, "We're going to go and attack the area." In June and July of 1099, there was a battle known as the Siege of Jerusalem. And then in July, on July the 15th of 1099, Christian forces took back control of Jerusalem. So then for about an 88-year period after this first crusade, this group basically sets up 4 crusader states. And one of the states was the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So for 88 years, there was another little pocket here where Jerusalem and Israel is recognized. But then in 1187, a Muslim leader named Saladin comes in and wipes that out again. So we're back to being scattered. All right, so we're going to move forward now about 400 years to the Ottoman Empire. I know last week we looked at how the empires just grew and grew and grew, and this is kind of the final empire before kind of the empires of that whole area are wiped out. So the Ottoman Empire was founded in 1299, and then it quickly expands, and we'll look at a map here in just a second, and basically just takes over the entire Asia, Europe area, and it gained its maximum power in the late 1400s. So in 1516, the Ottomans, they were called Turks because they started there in Turkey, and we looked at that on a map where it's just north of Israel. The Ottoman Turks invaded and occupied Palestine, or where Israel is at, what we've been studying. Interestingly, in 1535, so they had conquered the city, and 19 years later, an Ottoman leader, emperor named Suleiman the Magnificent, ordered that the walls of Jerusalem were rebuilt. So I got to looking at these walls. It was a 5-year construction project. These walls extended 2,497, 2,500 miles of walls they built in about a 5-year period. Listen to these walls. The walls averaged 39 feet tall and averaged 8.2 feet of thickness. There was 34 watchtowers built. There were 7 main gates for traffic. There was other points of entry. So anyway, the Ottoman Empire ruled. They were Islamic, but they did build this, the wall, and we'll talk about the Weeping Wall that was constructed here. Okay. Here's the catch to this wall. After he finished the construction, after about 5 years, he had an inscription written on the wall. And there's a long inscription. I'm going to read you the first part. Suleiman, it says, has decreed the construction of the wall, he who has protected the home of Islam with his might and main and wiped out the tyranny of idols. So we have an Ottoman Empire that's been in control, and they were in control for 402 years, that was just completely Islamic. All right. So I know that's hard to see. I'll pass maps out next week. I just wanted you to see everything in color. I know it's a bunch of different colors and it shows their acquisitions. That's all of the Ottoman Empire at the point it's destroyed, which we're getting to. So when we start comparing those maps of how small the empires were and how they expanded throughout really a 2,000-year period. Okay. Next, part 13 is the regathering. I thought this was interesting. What I've attached to this kind of cover slide, this is a 1917 election poster of a Jewish political leader. It's translated, "Where we live, there is our country." And so by 1917, as we'll see in just a minute, the regathering of the Jews to Israel is in full force by that point. All right, the promise of the regathering. This is a little, I tried to highlight the main passages, but over in Ezekiel 37, there's some prophetical verses talking about the regathering of the people. So in verse 1, it's a type here, but we'll see kind of what the type is explained. It says that there's a valley that's full of bones, and he said unto me, can these bones live? In verse 3. And then verse 5, it says, thus saith the Lord God unto these bones, I will cause breath to enter under you, and you shall live. Now, are they talking about real bones? Well, it's explained. Verse 11, then he said unto me, son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Verse 12, therefore prophesy and say unto them, thus saith the Lord God, behold, all my people, I will open your graves and cause you to come up out of your graves and bring you into the land of Israel. So a very specific prophecy there about the regathering of the people back to their land. Okay. Okay. This really gained steam in 1896. There was a guy, he was an attorney and a kind of philosopher by the name of Theodore Herzl. And he is kind of viewed by the Jews as kind of the father of this regathering and the Zionist movement. He wrote this book. Here it is. He was a lawyer, a journalist, philosopher. He wrote this book titled The Jewish State. It was published in 1896. He called for the Jews to form a single nation state like that of France or Germany. So I know it's been discussed throughout history, but this is where it was kind of really put into motion. In 1897, 11 years after the publishing of the book, he organized the World Zionist Organization. And it was formed, quote, the delegates at the Congress now define Zionism as the belief in the creation of a home for the Jewish people in Israel. So he forms this organization where their sole purpose is to go back and create the nation of Israel. And of course, that's in the late 1800s. Another verse that talks about the Zionist movement is Deuteronomy 30. It talks about, in verse 1, about the people being driven. Verse 2 says, and shalt return unto the Lord thy God, and shalt obey his voice according to all that I command thee this day. Verse 3, that then the Lord thy God will turn thy captivity and have compassion upon thee, and quote, return and gather thee from thy nations. So there's another verse that talks about the regathering of the Jews. Okay, so in terms of numbers, 1882, we have 25,000 Jews in what we now know as Israel. By 1914, there's 95,000 Jews. And 1914, what major world event starts? Yeah, World War I. So things really pick up here around 1914. Okay, next we have from 1914 to 1918, the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Of course, we saw they're the world power. They basically converted Israel into a fully Islamic state. So let's go through the background. On July the 28th of 1914, World War I has started. The Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, are at war with Britain, France, and Russia. The Central Powers versus the Allies. 3 months later, in October of 1914, the Ottoman Empire enters World War I and sides with Germany and Austria-Hungary. There was an event they called the Black Sea Raid, where the Ottomans attack a Russian port. Then in November, the Ottoman leader issues nationwide, he declares a jihad, basically calls his people to go out and kill as many allies as possible on November 14th of 1914. So they enter the war. Then in November of 1917, Britain begins what they call the Jerusalem Operation. The Jerusalem Operation in November of 17. And it is what it sounds like. General Edmund Allenby was the British military leader who basically leads his troops to conquer Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, and then the surrounding areas from the Ottoman Empire. And then by December, a month later, the Ottoman Empire surrenders Jerusalem to Britain. This picture here, I don't know if you can see it, that man right there in the front, I know it's tough to see, that's General Allenby. And this is pretty neat. They said that when he got near the city of Jerusalem, he got out of his vehicle to show respect for the holy city, said he refused to drive a vehicle into the city. He wanted to be the first Christian. Once the Islamic hold was broken, he wanted to be the first Christian to walk on the land, and he felt like it was more respectful to walk through. So that's him walking through. It says, I think it said, through the Jaffa Gate, which is one of the gates there on the walls. And it said he was the first Christian in many centuries to control Jerusalem, a city held holy by three giant religions. So by 1917, the Ottoman Empire is destroyed. Britain now controls this area. So two major events here happen within pretty short succession after the end of World War I. The first is what's called the Balfour Declaration. And I had always heard this, but I wasn't really sure what it was. That picture of that guy on the left is a man named Arthur Balfour. He was a British foreign secretary, basically a political leader for Britain. He writes a letter to Lord Rothschild. Rothschild was a British Jew who was pushing for Israel to grow. And he writes this declaration, which came to be known as the Balfour Declaration. And it says, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people. The government will make every effort to help bring this about. And it's a little bit longer, but anyway, this is Britain's commitment to help Israel create a nation. So we had the Zionist movement start in the late 1800s. By 1917, we have one of the world powers saying, we're going to support you with the creation of your nation. 3 years later, there is what's called the British Mandate. So by 1920, all of this land that had been controlled by the Ottomans and by the Germans that was in the area of Asia where Israel was at, they had to do something with this land. So they have to start dividing up some of the lands where the French had to basically figure out what to do with the lands. And then obviously the British had to figure out. So they were given a mandate. They were said, all right, you've got to do something with this land. So there's a conference in Italy in 1920. And at this conference, France is given certain areas, but Britain is allocated. They got to figure out what to do with Iraq, with Transjordan, which is Jordan, and we know where that's at. That's directly to the east. And then importantly to our study, they were given Palestine, as it was called in 1917. So this mandate initially gave the Jews 46,000 square miles that the Jews were basically going to be promised. Remember back to week 1. How many square miles is it now? About 8,600. So I did the math. It's 18%. So they've only got about 18% of what was initially promised. But if you look at the initial promise under that British mandate in 1920, they come in and say, okay, you're charged with doing what you're going to do with this land. Okay? So what do we do with the land? I was going to title this one, A Friend and a Foe. Who's that on the left? Yeah, he looks completely different. Most pictures you see of Winston Churchill, he's older, he looks completely different. He was a young man, so I tried to find something. He had just been appointed, let me make sure I say this right. He became the Secretary of State for the colonies. So he was charged with what to do with this land in 1921. And if Google's right, and it's never wrong, so that has to be right, that should be the way he looked around this time. So Winston Churchill is the man who's put in charge of deciding what to do with this land under the British mandate. So this is here's a speech that he made in 1921, soon after he becomes the Secretary of State for these colonies. He says, quote, "I believe that the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine will be a blessing to the whole world, a blessing to the Jewish race scattered all over the world, and a blessing to Great Britain." He continues later, "I firmly believe that it will be a blessing also to all the inhabitants of this country without distinction of race or religion." So Winston Churchill, Israel found an ally there on someone who was going to fully support the creation of the Israel as a nation state. So they have to come up with some kind of plan. There's obviously still fighting between the Muslims or the Arabs or the Palestinians. They're called different stuff, but anyway, and the Jews. So they do come up with a plan to basically divide up the 46,000 square miles. If you look at that, the partition there, which is the middle picture, proposes to give 77% of the land to the Arab states, which was called Transjordan. It's Jordan now. And then 23% to the Jewish state. And that's kind of, if you look at the purple, that's kind of what we know Israel as now. Everything to the west of the Jordan River. Then they basically, there's a League of Nations article, without going into the details, that basically kind of puts this has more political effect, where it says that they appoint a Jewish agency to help with this creation of this state. It says the purpose of this agency was to facilitate Jewish immigration and to encourage, quote, the close settlement by Jews on the land. In other words, it's kind of the difference between a politician in America. I'm not saying, yeah, I'm going to do this, and then actually trying to enact a law. So they really start putting some stuff into law where they're saying, okay, we are going to actually put into law the support of the creation of this nation. Okay. So during this same time, Adolf Hitler on the right is rising to power. We'll discuss him obviously more at length next week, but here's a speech that he made in 1922. He says, "My feeling as a Christian points me to my Lord and Savior as a fighter." All right, so we're fine so far. "It points me to the man Jesus, who once in loneliness, surrounded only by a few followers, recognized these Jews for what they were and summoned men to fight against them. How terrific was his fight against the Jewish poison." Now again, the point he's missing is Jesus was a Jew killed by non-Jews. He says later, "Today, after 2,000 years, with deepest emotion, I recognize more profoundly than ever before the fact that it was for this that he shed his blood upon the cross." He says, "I have the duty to be a fighter for truth and justice. And as a man, I have the duty to see to it that human society does not suffer the same catastrophic collapse as did the civilization of the ancient world some 2,000 years ago, a civilization which was driven to its ruin through this same Jewish people." So the Holocaust and all those events rose from, he felt like he was doing Jesus's bidding by killing the Jews. We'll get into the Holocaust. 6 million Jews were killed basically directly through his acts. Okay. So later, the 77-23 split is denied. Wars break out. They come back. Kind of the British says, all right, we'll give you 80%. Of course, they don't take it. I haven't found, from all my readings in the past 6-7 weeks, I haven't found Arabs take a deal yet. It doesn't matter what you offer, they're not going to take it. All right, so next, a couple major events in the 1930s that are leading us up to World War II. So there's something called the Peel Partition. And this is, there was Lord Peel. He's a British officer, and he's basically put in charge of, go figure out what we're going to do with this land. We keep offering these splits. We offer to divide up the land, and nothing seems to be working. So it says Lord Peel and his people go out and interview hundreds of British, Jewish, and Arabians and Muslims in this area. And the study, he comes back, and I guess he probably wastes a lot. We've been seeing how much the U.S. government wastes. He goes through a year-long study and puts together this full report. And he probably could have saved the government some money. He probably didn't need a full study for this, but here's what the study says. It says irrepressible conflict has arisen between two national communities within the narrow bounds of one small country. There is no common ground between them. Their national aspirations are incompatible. So he studied, and all his people studied and interviewed everybody that these people don't get along. So that was basically how that got summed up. The plan recommended that there be two separate states. And so we get to the White Papers. The White Papers were 2 years later in 1939. The British government was fearful of the Muslim states, the Arab states that encircle Israel. They were nervous that they were basically kind of getting in cahoots with Germany. Britain was trying to keep relations with the Arab nations cordial. Why? Oil. Everything I read is oil. So the government issued what it called the White Papers. I'm not sure why they call it the White Papers, but Britain declared that they would support a Palestinian nation state within 10 years. So Britain fully supported Israel, but here in these White Papers, they also said we're going to support a Palestinian state. And then interesting in these White Papers, part of these papers said that they were going to restrict the number of Jews that could move back to Palestine or Israel. They only allowed 10,000 Jewish immigrants in per year, which was strange. They also allowed a few refugees. And then they said after 5 years, so as of 1944, they said that no further Jewish immigrants will be allowed into Palestine or Israel without Palestinian approval. So I wish this whole story was so black and white, where Britain always supported fully Israel and they didn't. So the White Papers were kind of a twist where they start, backing, they're having to play both sides of the table, I guess, is the example. All right. So Britain is trying all these deals throughout the 30s and 40s. And they basically just throw their hands up in 1947. And the United Nations, where we hear a lot about United Nations. Now, United Nations got formed in 1947. And it's basically this, I don't really know how to describe United Nations. It's just a bunch of people who want to tell the whole world what to do. That's the best I can summarize it. So Britain has tried all these land deals, all these agreements. Nothing works. 1947, they go to the United Nations and say, you figure it out. This is your problem now. So on November the 29th of 1947, the UN passes what they call Resolution 181. And this is important to the Jewish nation, but they passed this in November of 47 called Resolution 181. And it's a plan where they said they're going to partition the land. West of the Jordan will be a Jewish state. East of the Jordan will be a Palestinian state. That's basically the effect what the United Nations said. So they also said as part of this, Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, is not going to be controlled by either side. They said it's going to be like a militarized zone. But Jerusalem, we're not going to have y'all fight over this area. We're going to split it up, and this is what we're going to do. So the importance of this resolution is the Jewish leader said, okay, well, we are allowed to have a nation now. And that's where Israel took that. So, part 14, the nation. Okay. So, the date that I didn't know anything about this, but I knew 1948. I've always heard 1948. Well, here it is. May 14th, 1948. There's your newspaper. State of Israel is born. Isaiah 66:8. Who hath heard such a thing? Who hath seen such things? Shall the earth be made to bring forth in one day? Or shall a nation be born at once? On May 14th, 1948, the nation was created. 11 minutes later, and I said this in class, President Truman of the United States was the first political leader in the world that recognized Israel as a nation state. So from literally day one, the United States has fully supported the state of Israel, and we'll see that a lot in the whatever the next 70 years or so. So before I get to the next slide, I was listening one time to a podcast about Bill Belichick. Everybody knows who he is. He's the football coach of the Patriots, and they said that he just 365 days a year he was consumed with it. And Tom Brady said that after they won their 6th Super Bowl, which is the most ever, I guess, for a player or a coach, said that they were on the plane back the next day, and everybody was celebrating and partying. And Tom Brady went up to Belichick, and Belichick had this folder out, and he's like, "Coach, what are you doing? We just won the Super Bowl." He said, "That was yesterday. I'm preparing for next year." So he was just so. Anyway, how does that tie into our story? I'm sorry, one more here. This is one more verse before we get to what happens the day after. Deuteronomy 11:17. Therefore say, thus saith the Lord God, I will even gather you from the people. And this is another promise. I will give you the land of Israel. So this is, again, this being fulfilled in May of 1948. So the day after Israel declares itself a nation, they're attacked by 5 nations. And so pretty short-lived. It's called different stuff. It's called the Arab-Palestinian War, but anyway, a lot of people call it the War of Independence. So they had declared their independence, and the Arab nations, and I give an arrow to each of the 5 nations that attacked. They said it was early in the morning, so literally less than 24 hours after being declared a nation state, they're under attack from 5 different directions. It says in this war that Israel lost over 1% of its entire population. I mean, think about that. What are we, 350 million? That would be 3.5 million Americans killed in a war. 1%. 1%, it said.
Less than 500,000.
So, yeah. So the war, it said that, I've actually got the number. It says 6,373 people were killed in this war. Israelis were. The war goes through the summer of 1949. It basically ends with what they call the green line, the color green, where Israel basically is agreeing for the West Bank, which we'll talk about, to be controlled by Jordan, Gaza to be controlled by Egypt, and that's kind of where the lay of the land is for about a 19-year period or so. Okay, so a couple interesting points here. Team building. So we have a new nation, and we have cobbled this thing together a little bit, and we kind of did it in short order, but we have to actually form a nation. So Israel does a couple major things here. First, they implement what they call the law of return. And what this is this is a law that basically says anybody that is a Jew is allowed to come and have immediate citizenship. So, Zach, that poses the question, who gets to go do this? So under this land of return, it defined what was considered a Jew that could come get it. They said it was a non-Israeli Jew, so a bloodline Jew that was not living in Israel, or a Gentile that has converted to Judaism. So that's your 2. So I got to looking into this question a little further. I said, well, what is a Jew? All right, so I went through some different articles, and Britannica actually had a really cool article that was cited to a bunch of stuff. But anyway, I tried to sum it up in 3 points. All Jews agree that a child born of a Jewish mother is a Jew. Reformed Judaism goes even further and says if either of your parents is a Jew, and then most people now agree that if you agree openly that you have converted to Judaism, you are also considered a Jew. So that's kind of your 3 parts of what is a Jew. I've also read, I've said you get all different kind of definitions, but simply put, that's what it is. The second point on team building, and I think we may have touched on this before, but there was compulsory military service starting in 1949. So starting in 1949, men were required to serve 30 months, and women had to serve 18 months. There were a few little carve outs, but for all intents and purposes, basically everybody there is required to be in the military. Why is that relevant? It says in the army, the young, newly arrived Jews, and you've got Jews coming from Europe, United States, Middle East, North Africa. You go out to San Francisco, we live in the same country, but we probably don't think the same. We probably don't talk the same or have the same beliefs. Well, think about you've got people coming from all over the world that are trying to form this nation and trying to all be one people. So one benefit that I read a lot about is they said this military training was an opportunity for these people to work together and view themselves as one. So that was really interesting, some of that stuff. So the compulsory military service, which is still in effect today, helped kind of unite the nation as a whole. They're going to need it later. In the 1950s, I don't have a slide on this. Basically, there's great instability. One event in October of 53, one Israeli woman and her 2 children are killed by the Palestinians when they basically accidentally cross over a line. The Israeli forces enter into the West Bank. They kill 69 of its inhabitants. So anyway, the 1950s are just filled with a lot of fighting between the two. All right, so part 15, and I may go one more slide and then we'll pick up from here. This right here is that's a Merkava tank, and that's the Israeli tank. They have 4 different versions of it, and there was I could have a whole cool thing on all the stuff this thing can do, but I'll leave that for somebody else. But just the shells that it can withstand and the amount of rounds it can put off was pretty cool. But I don't think this is a tank series, so we'll pass this. All right, so I'll finish with this story right here. The Suez crisis. All right, so let's set the stage. I know this is small, and I think the next one I've got a bigger picture. Okay, the Suez Canal. It's not a great picture. If you see it, everybody see where the Suez Canal's at? It's that little strip right there. All right, so let's see what happens here. In February of 1955, the Israelites, or Israel, they carry out an operation they call Operation Black Arrow. And I have a good illustration for that. It targeted an Egyptian army station right there on Gaza. And we know where Gaza's at. So during this attack, 38 Egyptian soldiers were killed, 8 Israeli soldiers were killed. Why did they attack this kind of Egyptian outpost there at Gaza? It says that there was a bunch of refugees who kind of were encamping there in Gaza, and Egypt was funding these guys to basically come in and create problems in Israel for all intents and purposes. So to quash that and to kind of send a message, Israel does this Operation Black Arrow, comes in and basically knocks out this little encampment of Egyptian military people. So the raid was organized by someone named Ariel Sharon. He's a young military leader who obviously is going to become the prime minister later, and we'll touch on him later in the class. So then this leads to, you're not going to follow this the first time because there's so many moving parts, but this is literally a Tom Clancy novel wrapped up in one more. So I'm just going to have to follow this. So there's an Egyptian president named Nasser, Nasser. He's the leader. He's humiliated because his little encampment there gets attacked by Israel. So he reaches out to the United States, and what does he ask the United States? We need some weapons. We want you to supply us with weapons so we can attack Israel. The United States does what the United States should. They refuse. The United States, we're not going to. So Nasser goes down his Rolodex and says, okay, now I'm going to contact Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia is an ally of the Soviet Union. We know what's heating up in the 1950s, the Cold War with communism. So the U.S. says, we're not helping you fight Israel. They go down the line. They go to Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia agrees to supply Egypt with weapons to fight Israel. So the United States and Britain don't take too kind to this because they feel like Egypt is now going to side with the communists. So right prior to this, Egypt is going to build this A1, A-W-A-N, a big dam. It was kind of that it was, they said this was the pride and joy of Egypt, and this was going to make them kind of more of a national power. They were going to build this dam. Well, guess who was going to fund this dam? The United States. So the United States says, oh, you want to go get in bed with the communists? We're not funding your dam anymore. They pull the funding. So what does Nasser do? Okay, you're not going to fund the dam anymore? How about this? I cut off the Suez Canal. It wasn't theirs to cut off. They didn't own it, but they took over the Suez Canal and did not allow the transport. Now, if you look at this map, what does that matter? Look at that map to the right. What it does. Instead of being able to transport oil and products there, you're now having to do this because of what Egypt did. Okay, I got 2 minutes. So, in response to this, Israel then attacks Egypt. They go through the Sinai Peninsula, which is where it's at. They come within 10 miles of the canal. Britain and France then attack and bomb the Egyptian airfield at the canal. So after all this, the United States then steps in and says to Britain and France, stop. Don't do this. And remember, they're the ones who were told Egypt no, but they tell Britain and France 9 days later, stop with the war. And they say the same thing to Israel. So this was humiliating to Britain and France. Why did the U.S. do it? And I put, I hate you, but I hate him even more. Because they were concerned that the Arab states were going to get tied in with the communists. So there's a lot of moving parts to that. But that's kind of the Suez War. All right, we'll pick up next week with, I think, the most interesting thing of the whole lesson, the 6 Day War.
Stop just for a second. Turn the lights on. Give you just a second. I'll give you a minute to get out. So when we go back through all this review, there's some things you need to kind of remember, and Wes will hit the high points. But in our generation, of course, obviously before we're born, World War I and World War II are huge. Here's what you need to remember. The thing about Hitler is crazy to think that he thought. And here's what Jesus said. Jesus said, one day there are people going to try to kill you, and they're thinking they're doing God's service. That's part of that same problem. But World War I was preparing the Jew for the land. World War II is preparing the land for the Jew. I'm going to leave you with that, but when we put all this stuff together prophetically, we'll show you how that the generation we're living in, you're at the very end of this thing, and it's just as if you're watching a movie, and it's playing out right in front of your eyes. All right, I'll give you guys a chance to get to your seats. Thank you for your time.